The desert dawn spread its pale fire across the horizon, the kind of light that bleaches a man's shadow thin until it seems ready to vanish. For riders came slow over the rise, their silhouettes bent and hardened by years of dust and lead. Horses labored under them, ribs showing through hide, but they pushed on, the creak of saddle leather and the occasional jangle of the spur, the only sound that disturbed the stillness. They were not men of speeches, nor men who sought comfort. They were men headed into the mouth of something they already knew would devour them. The lead rider's eyes were sun-bleached, cold with a kind of certainty that no prayer could soften. His jaw worked slow around a strip of tobacco as he scanned the town below, a scatter of wood and glass crouched against the endless sand. He had once believed in plans, in tidy endings to violent jobs, but not now, not on this ride. Beside him, another man laughed low in his throat, the sound more like gravel sliding down a wash. His hands never strayed far from his revolvers, twitching as if eager to speak the only language he trusted, gunfire. Behind them rode the quiet one, whose shoulders sagged under a weight no bullet could relieve. He carried memory more heavily than ammunition, the memory of a boy on a riverbank waving at him, the promise of return swallowed by the years. He had written no letters, offered no explanation. All he had left was the image of that child, and it followed him as faithfully as his own shadow. The last rider kept his hat pulled low, his rifle strapped across his back. He was younger than the rest, but already carved into something hard, something old before its time. Silence hung about him like a second skin, yet his gaze burned restless, hungry for whatever ending waited at the bottom of the street. The town had the look of something that had already surrendered. Shutters clattered loose on crooked hinges, and stray dogs slunk between the shadows of abandoned wagons. A woman drew a child inside, her eyes wide, her hand trembling at the curtain. Somewhere, a church bell swung without rhythm, swayed by nothing but the wind. The riders dismounted in front of a porch warped with age. The boards creaked under their boots as though complaining about the weight of men fated to stain them. They stood for a moment in silence, shoulders close, the smell of sweat and horse mixing with the dry air. None of them needed to speak. Years of shared trails and spilled blood had given them a language beyond words. A glance from the leader told the wild-eyed gunman what to expect. A twitch of the quiet man's brow promised he would follow through to the end. Even the youngest, silent and taut as wire, understood his place. They had walked too far into violence to turn back now. The sound came faint at first, like iron striking stone, a hammer pulled back, a rifle cocked. Smoke drifted from the windows of the building across the way. Dozens of eyes watched in the gloom within, rifles resting on sills, barrels hungry for their prey. The riders knew this house was no refuge. It was a trap, a nest of men waiting to cash in on the bounty of their blood. Still they advanced. The leader's boots struck the dirt hard as he crossed the street, every step measured, the weight of inevitability pressing down. Behind him, the others followed, their shadows stretching long across the dust. In the silence between breaths, each man carried his own reckoning. The quiet one thought again of the river. The wild-eyed gunman grinned, tasting death as though it were whiskey on his tongue. The youngest kept his hand near his rifle, whispering a prayer not to God but to the bullet that would carry his name. The door ahead of them sagged on its hinges, the glass panes beside it already webbed with cracks. Heat shimmered above the roof, warping the air like a mirage. Somewhere deep in the town, a horse shrieked as if it sensed what was coming. The men drew close to the porch, boots scraping against what's sticky with old sap and dust. Time seemed to hesitate, the air thick with gunpowder that had not yet been lit. The wild-eyed gunman chuckled again, the sound bouncing off the empty street. "Hell's waitin'," he muttered, voice dry as sand. The leader gave him nothing in return, only a hard stare at the door. Then, without warning, the silence tore apart. A single shot cracked from the darkness of the house. The sound split the morning open, echoing through every alley, rattling loose glass from its frames. The bullet smashed into the dirt inches from the leader's boot, spraying dust across his coat. In that instant the world narrowed to gun barrels and clenched jaws. Horses whinnied in panic, their hooves striking sparks as they pulled against reins. The woman who had hidden her child screamed once, Then silence claimed her voice. The wild bunch did not move for a heartbeat. Eyes met. A silent exchange passed between them, quicker than speech, deeper than any plan. They knew what had begun could not be undone. This was the opening note of the song they had been destined to play all along, a song written in blood and dust. The leader exhaled slow, his hand drifting toward the worn grip of his revolver. His companions mirrored him, steel whispering against leather. The porch seemed to groan beneath them, as if it knew the way to what was about to unfold. Smoke still lingered in the doorway, curling like a hand beckoning them forward. The quiet one shut his eyes for a single breath, letting the memory of the river fade. The youngest flexed his fingers once, then steadied them. The wild-eyed man's grin widened, his teeth flashing like a wolf's. The street held its breath. Then, with a resolve as sharp as the edge of a blade, the leader took another step forward. The others followed. The town, the men in the shadows, the very boards beneath their boots, all waited for the storm that had finally broken loose. And with that first shot still ringing in their ears, they walked together into the jaws of fate. Gunfire cracked the air open like a whip, and the stillness of the morning was shattered beyond repair. The wild bunch answered without hesitation, their revolvers and rifles roaring like thunder in the narrow street. Splinters leapt from the porch posts, glass burst into glittering shards, and the house across from them lit with muzzle flashes that seared through the shadows. The first exchange was not measured or careful. It was violent, desperate, as though the town itself had erupted in fury. The leader fired with the control of a man who had long ago made peace with violence. His revolver barked steady, every shot a punctuation mark written in smoke. He did not flinch at the bullets screaming past his ear or the shards would carving fresh lines across his coat. His focus was unbroken, his expression carved from stone, as if nothing in the world existed but the next man to fall beneath his barrel. Beside him, the wild-eyed gunman moved with reckless abandon, his laughter rising above the chaos like some unholy hymn. He squeezed off shots in pairs, wild but deadly, spinning between pillars of smoke, daring the enemy to claim him. A round clipped his shoulder, tearing cloth and flesh, but only made his grin widen. He was a creature who found joy in fire and blood, a man alive only when death closed in tight. The quiet one fought differently. His movements were efficient, stripped of show, his rifle lifting and lowering with grim precision. Each time he pulled the trigger, a man across the street crumpled, the crack of the shot lost beneath the storm of noise. Yet with every kill, his face grew heavier, as though he carried the weight of each body on his own back. His thoughts flickered, not to survival, but to that riverbank, to the son he would never meet again. Each bullet he fired was an apology whispered too late. The youngest crouched low, using the porch railing for cover. His rifle shook in his grip at first, nerves betraying the fire in his eyes. But when he squeezed the trigger, when he saw the spray of dust leap from an enemy's chest, his fear hardened into resolve. He reloaded with shaking hands, then steadied, finding rhythm in the storm. He would not be remembered as the one who faltered. If this was the day his name was carved into legend, he meant to etch it deep. Bullets whined past like angry insects. Men fell screaming from the house, their bodies thudding against the dirt. Blood ran down the steps, staining the boards dark. Horses kicked against their tethers and broke free, galloping wild-eyed through chaos. Smoke thickened, curling into the street, wrapping the fight in a gray shroud. The air stank of powder and iron, of sweat and death. A lull came sudden, sharp as the crack of silence after thunder. The rifle ceased for a breath, smoke drifting slow across the street. The wild bunch held their ground, their backs pressed to the porch posts, their chests heaving with effort. For that single heartbeat, they looked at one another, for men bound tighter than blood, breathing the same smoke, knowing the same truth. They would not leave this town alive. But in their silence, there was no fear, only the steady acceptance of men who had been walking toward this end since the day they first drew steel. The quiet one caught his breath, wiped blood from his cheek. The leader nodded once to him, a gesture without words but heavy with meaning. They were still standing, still fighting, still together. The enemy pressed again, fresh men filling the gaps of the fallen. Muzzle flashes flared from windows and doors, bullets hammering into the porch. tearing chunks of wood free. The wild bunch answered in kind. The wild-eyed gunman stepped into the open, revolvers blazing, cutting men down before a round slammed into his thigh. He staggered, dropped to one knee, but kept firing, spitting curses at the men who sought to bury him. The youngest dragged him back behind cover, jaw clenched, eyes fierce. He shouted something, but the words were lost to the roar. Still, the act itself spoke volumes, the instinct to protect, to fight beside his brothers until the very last breath. The wild-eyed gunman gave him a bloody grin, teeth red, and clapped him on the shoulder before reloading with shaking hands. The leader never slowed. His revolver clicked empty. He drew another as if time itself bent to his will. He fired at shadows and windows, at shapes moving through the haze. Men dropped, their rifles clattering against the boards. His precision never faltered, though blood seeped from a cut along his forehead, streaking his vision. The quiet one's rifle emptied, and he drew his pistol. He fired without haste, each shot measured, his lips moving in silence. Whether prayer or memory, no one knew. His eyes were fixed far away, as though he already stood at the riverbank, waiting for the boy to arrive. Each bullet he sent into the smoke felt like a tolling bell, counting down what little time remained. The battle swelled again, louder, fiercer. The porch itself shook beneath the violence, boards splintering and groaning. Men screamed as bullets found them. Others cursed, firing blindly into the haze. The wild bunch held the line, their bond stronger than the storm that raged against them. Then, just as quickly as it had erupted, the fight stilled again. The enemy drew back, dragging their wounded with them, their dead left strewn across the street. Smoke curled into the pale sky, blotting the sun. Blood ran down the steps like a dark river, pooling in the dust. The wild bunch stood, battered, bleeding but unbroken. For a moment, silence stretched wide, save for the ragged pull of their breath. The leader's gaze swept the street, then lifted to the windows across the way. The fight was not finished. This was only the beginning. He could feel it in the way the air hung heavy, in the way the ground itself seemed to wait for the next round of violence. The youngest wiped grime from his face, his eyes searching the others. The quiet one nodded to him, grim and steady. The wild-eyed gunman pushed himself upright, limping but alive, his grin refusing to die. The leader checked the weight of his revolver, then slid it back into its holster. His hand lingered near the grip, ready, waiting. The porch beneath them was slick with blood, the boards creaking under the weight of bodies, both living and dead. The house across the street still loomed, dark and silent now, but its walls had more men, more rifles, more death. The wild bunch knew the truth. The next wave was coming, heavier than the last. And when it came, there would be no retreat, no mercy. They shared one last look, wordless but certain. Whatever came through those doors, whatever shadows rose against them, they would meet it as they had always done, together, unyielding, fire in their hands and fate at their backs. The silence deepened, and the wind picked up, stirring the dust and ash that drifted across the street. Somewhere, a rifle bolt clicked into place. Somewhere, a man muttered a prayer, and then the storm was ready to break again. The smoke clung thick to the street, curling in ghost-like swirls that caught the rising sun and turned the air into a haze of fire and ash. The wild bunch moved through it slowly, boots dragging across boards slick with blood, their breaths rasping like men already half buried. Around them, bodies lay twisted in unnatural repose, eyes staring blankly at the pale sky. The buzzing of flies had already begun, a merciless chorus rising faster than prayers. The town was quieter now, but the silence was no comfort. It was a kind that pressed against the chest, heavy with the knowledge that worse was waiting just beyond the smoke. The leader led them forward, his revolver loose but ready in his hand. His steps were steady, but his gaze sharpened at every creak, every shadow sliding against a broken window. He had lived too long on the edge of ambush to mistake this pause for victory. His men followed without hesitation, bound him not by command but by the strange gravity of men who shared the same death sentence. The wild-eyed gunman limped beside him, favoring the leg that had been torn by lead. Yet even wounded, he moved with reckless swagger, his grin splitting his blood-stained face. He wiped at the crimson soaking his thigh, looked at it, and chuckled low in his throat as though the wound were nothing but a barroom joke. "Still standing," he rasped, his voice coarse but alive. He was the kind of man who would laugh even as the earth swallowed him whole, and the others drew a strange comfort from that feral defiance. Behind them came the quiet one, his eyes lowered, his rifle cradled as though it were not a weapon but a burden. Each body they passed, he seemed to carry on his shoulders, his gaze resting too long on faces already gone. When he paused, it was not in fear of ambush but to study the dead, as if he sought to fix them in memory. Perhaps he believed he owed them that. Perhaps he knew he would soon join them. Still, when the leader lifted his hand, the quiet one moved on, his silence as resolute as the steel he bore. The youngest trailed close, his rifle steady now, his face hardened by the baptism of the first fight. His eyes no longer flickered with hesitation. They burned sharp and unyielding. He had found his rhythm in the chaos, and though youth clung to him in the tightness of his jaw and the quickness of his breath, something older had settled there too. The boy who had once trembled was gone. What remained was a man forged in the storm, a fighter who had tasted blood, and learned he could stand the fire without flinching. The saloon loomed ahead, its upper windows blackened, the door swinging wide on a hinge blown loose. From within came the shuffle of boots, the scrape of furniture dragged into barricades, the faint mutter of voices rallying for another assault. The leader signaled with a tilt of his chin, and the bunch pressed forward, mounting the sagging porch with weapons drawn. The boards groaned under their weight, echoing as if the building itself recognized a fate about to be carved into its walls. Inside, the air was thicker still, a mingling of smoke, sweat, and blood. Shadows clung to every corner, long and uncertain, broken only by the thin shafts of light that pierced through bullet-riddled shutters. The bunch moved as one, each man scanning, listening, hearts beating not in panic, but in the steady thrum of inevitability. A stairway rose crookedly in the gloom, steps stained dark where blood had dripped from above. The leader's eyes narrowed on it, reading the trap as clearly as if it had been spelled out in ink. Yet there was no hesitation. This was not a fight to be dodged. This was a path laid before them, and they would take it step by step, breath by breath, until nothing remained. The wild-eyed gunman laughed again, a low growl that made the rafters seem to quiver. He slammed a fresh round into his revolver and limped to the foot of the stairs. "Hell's upstairs," he said, his grin stretching wolf-like. The youngest moved to his side, rifle raised, jaw clenched, ready to storm the shadows. The quiet one lingered a moment, eyes closing as if in prayer, before lifting his weapon once more. The leader took the first step, and the others followed without question. The stairs groaned under them, each creak loud enough to be a gunshot. Their boots left dark prints where blood had already seeped. Midway up, the leader froze. He had seen the glint of steel above, a rifle barrel waiting in the gloom. His revolver barked once, the shot exploding against the shadows. A cry followed, a body tumbling down, striking the steps in a thunderous fall. The trap was sprung. Gunfire erupted in the narrow hall above. Bullets split wood, sparks flying from the railing as the bunch pressed upward into the hailstorm. The wild-eyed gunman roared with savage joy, firing both pistols blindly into the dark, each report lighting his face in ghostly flashes. The quiet one advanced slower, every shot measured, methodical, his eyes never blinking. The youngest charged forward with reckless fire, rifle kicking against his shoulder, teeth clenched in fury. And the leader moved steady, always steady, as though the chaos bent to his command. The hallway above became a furnace. Men shouted, cursed, screamed as bullets tore through plaster and flesh alike. Blood painted the walls, dripping in rivulets down the warped boards. The air was deafening with gunfire, the close quarters fight turning brutal and personal. A rifle but cracked against a skull, a knife flashed in the dim light. Fists slammed into ribs already broken. It was not battle but butchery, each man fighting like an animal clawing for one more breath. When the gunfire thinned, when the screams ebbed, the hall was a ruin. The bunch stood among the fallen, their bodies slick with sweat and blood, their breath rattling like men dragging chains. The wild-eyed gunman leaned against the wall, his leg failing him, but his grin endured even through the crimson that soaked his clothes. The quiet one sat heavily on a step, wiping at the blood on his hands, as though he might cleanse something deeper. The youngest chest heaved, his eyes blazing, the barrel of his rifle smoking in the dim light. The leader checked his revolver, expression unreadable, gaze already turned to the next door, the next fight, the next inevitability. Outside, the silence was shattered by a chorus of voices rallying in the street. More boots stamped the dust, more rifles clattered into readiness. The enemy was gathering, regrouping, preparing to crush what remained of them. The bunch knew this lull was only a heartbeat, a pause between storms. The leader raised his head, eyes catching the shaft of light that cut across the ruined hallway. He holstered his weapon slowly, the gesture calm, steady, as though nothing could shake his resolve. The others watched him, their bond unspoken yet absolute. They were battered, bloodied, half-broken, but they were still standing. And standing meant they would fight again. The boards creaked beneath their boots as they moved back toward the light. Smoke and dust swirled, wrapping them in a shroud that smelled of powder and death. The town waited outside, armed and hungry, ready to finish the work. Yet, when the leader stepped toward the door, the others followed without question, drawn into the gravity of his will. The street was quiet, but the silence pulsed with danger, like the moment before lightning splits the sky. The bunch emerged into it, weapons heavy, bodies weary, faces set. They knew what was coming. The sun had climbed higher, turning the town into a kiln where every shadow looked like a grave marker. The wild bunch stumbled out from the saloon's wrecked doorway, their boots dragging over boards wet with blood. Smoke swirled thick around them, clinging to their skin, stinging their eyes, but they moved forward all the same. The porch was no longer just wood and nails. It had become an altar, waiting to claim them whole. Across the street, more men gathered, rifles gleaming in the light, their voices rising in a harsh chant of courage. The circle was closing, and there would be no way through but fire. The leader stood at the edge of the porch, revolver in hand, his face unreadable beneath the grit and blood streaking his skin. His men fanned beside him, each marked by wounds but unbroken. The wild-eyed gunman leaned heavy on his bad leg, his grin crooked, feral, refusing to surrender even as his strength faltered. The quiet one checked the chamber of his pistol, movement steady though his shoulders sagged with invisible weight. The youngest gripped his rifle tight, his knuckles white, his breath sharp with the fire of youth unwilling to yield. Together, they looked less like outlaws and figures already carved into legend, bound by the inevitability of the fight. The first volley erupted with no warning. Bullets screamed into the porch, shattering beams, tearing chunks from the boards. Dust and splinters filled the air as the bunch answered with their own storm. The leader fired clean and deliberate, every pull of the trigger a death sentence carried across the street. The wild-eyed gunman roared with laughter, revolvers blazing, his defiance louder than the gunfire that tore past his ears. The quiet one moved with the grace of sorrow, his shots falling true even as his lips whispered to ghosts no one else could hear. The youngest fired fast and hard, the kick of his rifle shaking him, yet his aim grew sharper with every round, his fury carrying him beyond fear. The porch shook under the weight of the battle. Bodies piled at the steps, blood pooling across the boards, dripping into the dust below. The enemy pressed harder, pouring from alleyways and corners, but the bunch held a line, their shoulders brushing as they fought, their unity unbroken. They had become a single thing, for men moving as one, answering every charge with fire and steel. Then the wild-eyed gunman took a bullet square in the chest. It spun him back, slammed him against the railing. He spat blood, laughed even as it choked him, and raised his revolvers one last time. His shot struck true, felling two more men before his knees buckled. He slid down the rail, still grinning to the red, his laughter fading into silence. The others did not pause. They fought harder, as though his wild spirit had been poured into their hands. The quiet one fell next. A bullet struck his side, and he staggered, dropping to one knee. His pistol shook, but he lifted it, fired again, and another man collapsed across the way. He coughed, blood spilling from his mouth, and for a heartbeat he seemed to see something far beyond the smoke. The shimmer of a river, the face of a boy waiting on its bank. A faint smile touched his lips before the strength left him. He slumped forward, his body still, his pistol slipping from his grasp. The leader and the youngest fought on. The two of them pressed back against the doorway. The porch littered with the fallen. The leader's revolver clicked empty, and he drew his last. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes burned with iron will. The youngest fought like fire, his rifle spitting until the barrel steamed, until his hands bled from reloading too fast. He shouted as he fired, a raw cry that cut to the storm of noise, the voice of someone who refused to die quietly. But the circle tightened, bullets slicing closer, sharper. The youngest cried out as a round tore through his side, but he stayed on his feet, teeth bared in defiance. He turned his rifle on the nearest shadows, cutting them down before another shot caught him. He staggered, blood blooming across his shirt, yet even then he raised his weapon again. Only when his strength gave out, when his body could no longer obey his will, did he finally fall, his rifle slipping from his grasp with a hollow clatter. The leader stood alone now, the last of the wild bunch, his boots planted firm on the porch. Around him, his brothers lay still, their blood soaking into the boards. Across from him, the enemy paused, their rifles trained, their voices hushed. For a moment, no one moved. The leader lit a cigarette with hands that did not shake. Smoke curled around his face, mingling with the haze of battle, and he exhaled slow, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though already looking past this world. Then he drew his revolver, raised it high, and fired again. The street exploded with return fire. Bullets ripped through wood, tore into flesh, splintered bone. Still he stood, his revolver blazing, each shot a final act of defiance. He struck men down with uncanny precision, his body staggering under the punishment, but his will unbroken. One last round echoed, and a man fell screaming into the dust. Then the leader's revolver clicked empty, the chamber spinning hollow. He stood swaying, blood pouring down his coat, his eyes unyielding even as his knees weakened. A final shot rang out, sharp and merciless. His body jerked, the cigarette falling from his lips. He collapsed onto the blood-soaked porch beside his fallen men, his revolver slipping from his hand. Silence followed, heavy and absolute,